Okay, I bet you're wondering who I am. My name is Judson Luciak. You've probably seen me around the youth building during youth nights because I get to lead the grade 9 boys with Silas. So, here's a couple of facts about me. I'm an elementary teacher. Rebecca and I share the same last name, which means we are married. And I like to read, hunt, fish, and pretty much do anything active outside. Now, last week, Sid's talk touched on the Israelites' journey through the desert into the Promised Land and how Israel cried out to God for some food. Low key, the Israelites almost chose a new leader among them. This week, we'll be picking up where Sid left off. The Israelites are still wandering in the desert and are having to face many challenges in order to reach the Promised Land. Now, my older brother, when he was young, was out walking our dog Chemo with our grandma. Chemo was an Akita, and for those that don't know, Akitas are huge. So picture this. My older brother, he's like 4 or 5 years old, about this tall, and 35 pounds soaking wet, holding a leash to this massive dog. The paws on it were actually this big. I'm not even kidding. My brother was probably thinking, yeah, look at me go. I've got this. Then all of a sudden, Chemo spots something that interests him. Probably a squirrel or a car. And Chemo starts booking it as fast as he can. Guess what? Or guess who is still holding on to the leash for dear life? Yep, my brother. While holding on to that leash, my brother is holding on to an unspoken promise from Chemo that this huge dog will be easy to hold on to, will stay seated, and will be idle and easy to handle. But Chemo sure doesn't keep that promise, because Chemo is a dog and wants to chase things, and my brother gets pulled along for the ride. Yet, after a couple of seconds of pain, my brother eventually lets go. Who would blame him for letting go, right? What 4 or 5-year-old would want to hang on for dear life to a horse of a dog? My brother's story is similar to how the Israelites treat God's promise, which is shown on page 64 or on Genesis 12:2. Because Chemo, like God's promise, won't be easy to hold on to. It's going to pull them in all different kinds of directions as a nation. Now, I bet at the start, the Israelites were probably thinking, look at us. We've got a promise. And we've got God on our side. How could this go wrong? This will be easy. But guess what? Things get difficult after the promise is made, and Israel wavers with holding on to this not so easy to hold promise. This promise is a big bargain and is going to take some effort to come full circle. Now, Israel's posture towards God's promise connects well to God's little nickname for the Israelites. Remember way back on page 64 when God calls the Israelites a stiff-necked people? This is right after Moses finds the Israelites worshiping a golden calf. This nickname is an interesting one. When it's unpacked, it implies a stubborn or not to be led kind of people. God straight up calls the Israelites a people not to be led, but God still tries to lead them. Interesting, right? On one hand, God wants to lead Israel, but on the other hand, the Israelites keep ignoring, then picking up the promise given by God again and again and again. What's the deal? I find it interesting that God calls the Israelites a stiff-necked people. It makes sense to me why God does this because the Israelites are pretty stubborn. But the reason I find this nickname interesting is God tries time and time again to show the Israelites that he will provide them exactly what they need and will follow through with his promise regardless of the challenges the Israelites face. Yet, Israel continues to let go of God's promise and at the same time let go of their God-given identity as a chosen people. Side note, here's some homework. Read Deuteronomy 7 for context. God further defines himself to the Israelites here, and it's actually a solid passage. What justifies this nickname from God is how the Israelites don't really act on their God-given identity. Look on page 80, how they're forced to go the long way around the border town on the outskirts of Edom. The reaction is to say, "Why have you, God," and Moses, "brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread. There is no water. And we detest this miserable food." I think it's a little funny that the Israelites just had to add that last line, as though it's the last straw. It's almost though there is no trust between Israel and God. Hasn't God done great things for the Israelites already? What's ironic about the complaining from the Israelites is after they complain, the Israelites win consecutive battles against some pretty big foes, King Sihon's army and King Og's army. There should be no doubt that God is with Israel and that Israel will be taken care of. But Israel keeps dropping the ball on following God's promise. Why? So after the Israelites win those two battles, the story moves to a king named Balak, trying to defeat Israel by getting this guy named Balaam to curse the Israelites. King Balak offers Balaam a fortune to do so, but God demands that Balaam bless the Israelites instead. Again, what I want to focus in on here is how God is holding on to his promise for the Israelites. And can you guess what the Israelites end up doing? They drop God's promise again. Some of the Israelite men start worshiping Baal, the god of the king who is trying to curse them. I'd suggest reading the whole story for yourself, as it's actually a pretty good one. You can find it in chapter 6 on pages 81 to 82 of your storybook, or in Numbers 22 in your Bible. Could you imagine how different the story would have been if the Israelites had chosen to hold true to God's promise? Trusting that regardless of what comes their way, or however the situation looks, God has Israel's back. Although, could you imagine what the story of the Israelites would have been like if God had actually wiped out Israel and started again with Moses? But that's not who God is. He's not like these other gods. I think an interesting piece of context to consider is about how the gods in that time period were viewed or understood. I bring this up because it sheds light on God's identity and character. In this book I'm reading, What is the Bible?, the author says that in the ancient world, the gods were believed to be distant, detached, petulant, waiting for you to offer them sacrifices to appease their wrath and keep them on your side. That's how people saw gods. Do whatever it takes to keep their favor. Offer whatever you have. Sacrifice what is needed. Go to whatever lengths you can to pacify the anger of the gods. Our God is not like that, the other gods in the ancient world. So much so that God is the one working hard to protect, bless, and give to the Israelites, which is the complete opposite stance that a traditional God of the ancient world would actually do. This God of the Israelites is different. The thing about him is he stays close to the Israelites all throughout their wandering. Remember how God guided the Israelites to the Red Sea? It was through a pillar of cloud to guide them, and by night, a pillar of fire to give them light. Remember how God gave them water from a rock, gave them manna and quail? There's countless moments in the Bible during the Israelites' wandering, yet the Israelites lose sight of God's plan and his promise. And so the relationship between God and Israel's wandering really boils down to God consistently being by the Israelites' side, and the Israelites consistently seeing God move for them. But the Israelites keep forgetting that they are to be different from other nations. Deuteronomy 7:6 talks about how Israel is to be a chosen people who are meant to be set apart from other nations. But Israel struggles to believe God. So, we know that the Israelites keep dropping the ball on being a chosen people and holding on to God's promise. But how does this connect to you and me? I remember when I was in grade 8 and I was having a pretty decent day. Nothing was really going wrong with this day until my class and I started walking to the gym. This guy named Tristan walked up beside me while the class was walking to the gym and told me to my face that no one wanted me in grade 8 or in the school, and then he told me that I should leave. Something that a lot of people don't know about me is I was ruthlessly bullied while in grade 8 to 12, and it was not fun. I moved schools from Kelowna to northern Alberta in grade 7 to live with my mom, thinking it would be a great idea, but it was one of the toughest 4 years of my life. It caused me to question whether I belonged at school, at home, with my friends, my family, and it caused me to question everything about myself. My identity had been burst into a million pieces. It rattled me to the core. Now, fast forward a couple of years later. I'm older and more mature than when I was in grade 8. I was about 23 years old and I was working in northern Alberta for the summer and had been going to this local gym to unwind and decompress from a long day of work. During a regular session at the gym, guess who I bumped into? Yep, my grade 8 bully, Tristan. That's not even the best part. Guess what God asks me to do? I distinctly heard God ask me to walk up to Tristan and forgive him to his face. Can you guess my reaction to what God wanted me to do? Well, let's just say I didn't want to forgive him. While working out, I had a long conversation with God about how forgiveness and why he wanted me to forgive Tristan. Eventually, I make my way up to Tristan and ask him if he remembered me. I told him my name and told him that he made my grade 8 year a horrible experience. He then told me that he remembered me and that he was very sorry. He explained to me about how he was horribly bullied by girls when he was younger, which caused him to bully others. Now, I didn't laugh at him, but instead, I told him I came over to him to forgive him. You know what's interesting? I could have chosen not to forgive Tristan. I could have said some nasty words to Tristan and stormed off feeling a little better about myself. But instead, God asked me to do something different. He asked me to live and act from a place of deep-rooted identity in God, knowing that God would work out a horrible circumstance for good. I put my hope in God. When I confronted Tristan, he could have responded in a completely different and negative way than how he did. He could have still been that bully all those years ago and tried to bully me again, laughing at me like he did, pointing out my flaws. But remember this. Let the story of Israel's wandering remind you of the importance of holding on to God's promise and sticking to them regardless of what you see or feel. He can be trusted because he is not like the ancient gods of old. He's different, close, and not distant. Now, Romans 8:28 says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." If you have accepted Christ, then you are called to his purpose. You, like the Israelites, are called to be a people who act differently, a community who acts from a sense of rooted identity in God, to be a light in the darkness, love in a cold world.